Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thank you for joining us this week on Market Journal. Lots to get to on this week's show, so let's jump right in. And beginning our broadcast, many farmers in neighboring Iowa are trying to recover after a devastating storm earlier this week. On Monday, a derecho event packing winds of 100 miles per hour, the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane, flattened crops in their fields, tore apart buildings, and collapsed grain bins. Officials estimate roughly 1/3 of Iowa's 30 million acres of agricultural land was impacted by the storm, with the middle part of the state being hit the hardest. Portions of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin felt the effects of the storm too. In fact, we told you last week that Iowa State University's Lee Schultz would join us for our market segment today. Unfortunately, we had to reschedule with him due to the storm, but Darin Newsom of Darin Newsom Analysis is pinch hitting for us. He joined me on Wednesday after the release of the eagerly anticipated August WASDE Report to discuss what that means and how this weather event in Iowa impacts it.
That was probably the biggest thing of today, in that nobody's paying attention to USDA's report, which I like, that basically folks are ignoring it because they know the new crop production numbers are a joke, because they can't take into account what we saw happen Monday. And so there's just too much uncertainty about how much damage was done. The market will tell us in time. We've just got to give it a few days for it to start sorting it out. And then we'll see it in basis, we'll see it in spreads, and we'll see how it starts to register.
Historically, when events like this happen during the growing season and impacts, by early estimates, maybe about 10 million acres, how do the markets respond?
Historically, we would see, we would see the non-commercial side or the fund traders just jump in and run with this thing, particularly if we're talking about, hundreds of millions of bushels lost in a key state like Iowa. Here again, we're talking about the possibility of 10 million acres affected by this to varying degrees. But again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of bushels of corn, who knows how much soybeans. So in the past, we would see fund traders really jump on this and start to move. We don't see that as much anymore because there's more algorithm trade. Most of them aren't, they're not really based on headlines anymore. They've learned not to do that. So now we're waiting for momentum signals and all of these other things. To me, it's going to be more important as to what happens with the spreads, with basis, when we start seeing the commercial side come into play. If they start to get concerned, and if we start to see this carry, the little bit of carry that's in soybeans and the stronger carry that's in corn, start to get trimmed away, start to get cut, then we're going to see that there's some real concern out there about the possibility of tightening up supplies.
Darin, you mentioned earlier about this week's WASDE report and how the events of Monday already make a lot of that report old news. So that being said, what quick thoughts can we take away from Wednesday's report?
The quick thoughts that it was another waste of time, that we really don't even need these things. They came in, USDA came in something like 181 bushels per acre on corn. Well, that's fine. We've seen private estimates in the 182, 183 range. So, there really wasn't anything there. Production for corn, 15.2, 15.3, something like that. To me, the biggest thing was what happened with old crop demand. We did see corn exports increased a little bit. Everything else, all the other legs of demand were left unchanged. And soybeans, they left exports unchanged, and that's interesting to me. And that it still looks like we're going to come up short. We're going to have a big last few weeks here in August to get up to the 1.65 billion bushels USDA continues to talk about. And then looking ahead to new crop, USDA increased soybean export demand by 75 million bushels from the previous month. I'm not that bullish. I think they're overstating it a little bit. And despite that, we saw a sizable jump in new crop ending stocks, again, because production went up. So there's a lot of mixed signals right now in both new crop corn and soybeans. And I really feel like that's why the market in general just left it alone.
Let's pivot to the livestock markets now. And from everything that you hear, the processing slowdowns seem to be behind us. So have we gotten to a point in the cattle markets where we're approaching a bit of stability here in this third quarter?
You know, from the news and headlines, it certainly seems that way. The market seems to be anything but stable right now because fundamentally, I know the cattle demand, the demand for beef just isn't as strong as what it's supposed to be. I think we're looking ahead. Are we going to be short of beef? The cash market continues to go up, all while there's more concern about the unemployment number, the jobless claims that keep coming out. To me, it looks like the market in general right now is watching the stock markets rather than the economy, and we really have to emphasize those are two distinct things. The economy does not equal the stock markets. The economy's got some problems, and the stock markets are going to new highs. Right now, cattle market seems to be wanting to follow the stock markets, not unusual, and we see the cash market continuing to go up. I think we're going to hit a tipping point at some time. Future spreads still aren't bullish. We've moved, at least into the neutral range. If we look at the October, December, these Feb's still a little bit bearish as we head into and look further out into the winter months. So I still think there's some concerns fundamentally for the cattle market right now. Just seems to be shrugging it off.
And for pork, concerns in that market as well?
Again, if we look at the export demand numbers, very strong. But if we look at our overall supply numbers, they're still huge. October Feb spread still bearish. This, again, is a bit of a concern to me as we head into the fall and winter. As long as we can keep that demand going, then I think the market's going to hold together relatively well. But it's tentative. And again, after the release of reports here in midweek, we saw some more commercial selling starting to emerge in the hog market. It's never a good sign, trying to build a rally off of while the commercial side is selling. So it's a bit of a concern again, because spreads remain bearish, supplies remain large. We're going to have to continue to see strong demand.
And finally today, could you leave us with any marketing or risk management advice for our livestock producers watching?
Yeah, starting with the cattle market, we're looking at the August, Feb, April contracts all moving to new highs for this rally here this week. What we need to do is keep a close eye on this. They're all sharply overbought, so they could turn on a dime, particularly if we start taking the economy back in, building the economy back into the equation. So we want to be very careful there. We want to look for some hedging opportunities. We don't want to jump the gun, but we want to certainly look for opportunities or signals that these markets are starting to turn, these contracts are starting to turn. As for the hogs, it looks like, again, these, August, Feb contracts just getting rolling on some uptrends on their weekly chart. So we may want to give them some room, but we have to be careful if the commercial side starts selling. If they start getting ahead of us in the hedging, we're going to have to jump in there and get some positions on.
Next week, we'll be joined by author and analyst Elaine Cubb. Moving on, and it's time for another crop disease update. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems gives us the rundown on what diseases to look for in your cornfields.
We've had a lot of variable weather conditions across Nebraska this year, and so are our diseases across the state in our various crops, especially in corn and soybean. And so I want to give you an update on some of the things that we're seeing and make sure people are aware of, and that we don't have any surprises later in the season. And so in some areas where we've got wet conditions and some in dry, diseases are really up and down. And so, for instance, in corn, we normally would see a lot of gray leaf spot, the rectangular lesions in the lower half of the canopy. In some parts of the state, it's taking off, like even up north where we don't always see it, and maybe we're seeing a lot less than we normally would. But in other areas of the state, it's blowing up and beginning to become much more severe, like in the northeast part of the state. Down south, maybe not as much, but you won't know till you get out there. In addition, northern corn leaf blight has been worse this year and at least more widespread. Those are larger lesions that are cigar-shaped, and we've got a few of those now, and in some areas that one is getting worse. So be on the lookout for that one. Earlier, you probably heard us mention that southern rust had moved into the state. I want to give you an update on what we're seeing for southern rust. That disease is now spread and been confirmed in over 50 counties in Nebraska, especially most of the counties in the eastern half of the state where we've confirmed southern rust. More or less, some more severe, some much less, where it's difficult to find. The important thing to understand is southern rust can be a devastating disease, especially if it moves into fields that were later planted and are at earlier stages of development. And so, for example, we're getting a lot of questions about whether or not to treat for southern rust. And foliar fungicides do a good job controlling this disease. One of the problems might be that if applications were made at VT before disease developed, some of those may be beginning to wear off. And so be sure to look out for that. In addition, if fields are in the mid-dough stages or later than that, we have a much slimmer chance of getting a return on the investment for applications made to corn right now. Please get out and scout those fields, because southern rust especially is very patchy in fields and in counties, and you won't know what's out there until you get out and look for it. When you look for southern rust, look for those tan to orange pustules. Most of the spores are produced on the upper side of the leaf, and the pustules are tightly packed together in a wad on that leaf that can range anywhere from the size of your hand to covering the entire leaf. You might even notice some secondary spread within fields and small pustules, tiny individual ones in leaves neighboring where those original leaves are, and that's evidence of spread there. If you need help diagnosing any of these diseases or have questions, please contact us in Nebraska Extension and submit samples to the UNL Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic.
If you'd like to see which counties southern rust is present in, we've got a link to the tracking website Tamra mentioned. That's on the Market Journal website. And next week, Tamra is back with us again. She's going to discuss some updates with soybean diseases. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, as we mentioned at the top of the show, big weather event earlier this week with that derecho, but for us here in Nebraska, it's been another hot week. What can you tell us?
Yes, Troy, we had quite the event in Iowa. That derecho event just skirted to the north and to the northeast of Nebraska. We got a little bit of the wind, but most of the severe weather crossed Iowa. Considerable damage. It's going to take a while to know the full extent, but considerable hunk of the central part of the state got nailed pretty good on this one, and winds up to 100 to 110 miles per hour. There's not much that can withstand that in this region, at least of the country. And we're dealing with the hot and dry weather. And unfortunately, as we go forward in time, the opportunities for significant moisture are not there. But there is at least a slight cool down, particularly in the eastern half of the state during the first half of this period. And then things start to warm up as we go later into the week. So let's get right to the forecast and look at the upper air models, see what the precipitation chances are really at as we go forward in time. As you can see from today's upper air model, we're dealing with that high pressure ridge in the southwest build up with the Central Rockies, and that trough that brought the cold front through the state during the overnight hours is moving off to the east of us. High pressure falling in on the back side of that cold front. Of course, it's going to bring some cooler weather into our region, slightly drier air as the precipitation exits southeastern Nebraska during these morning hours. We'll see a fairly nice day for the remainder of the day. That ridge goes a little bit farther north, and we'll see a piece of energy trying to move down the front side of that ridge, but it looks like it's going to skirt to the east of us. And we'll be pretty much under the high pressure across the state. The only organized precipitation of any consequence is basically a little piece of impulse going across Oklahoma and Kansas. And then by Monday, we start to see that ridge expand. We might see some frontal boundary thunderstorm activity along the front range, high pressure firmly in control over the upper Midwest. There's just not a lot of moisture there to deal with. Most of these are going to be just scattered thunderstorms develop in the afternoon and then fizzle out as the nighttime progresses. By Tuesday, the warmth starts to return to western Nebraska. We start to moderate our temperatures in eastern Nebraska. Get a little pressure system up in Montana that's going to ride down the front of this ridge. Might actually induce some thunderstorm activity in southwestern Nebraska. But most of that will remain well to our west and will not make it into eastern Nebraska. By Wednesday, now we start to see the relaxation of the temperatures as the ridge starts to build even farther toward the east. Low pressure once again develops in eastern Montana. That might send another piece of energy down the front side of this ridge. That'd be targeting central and western Nebraska for isolated thunderstorms. By the time we get to Thursday, the heat starts to return in earnest to eastern Nebraska. We do see one piece of energy trying to move around the periphery of that ridge. That may bring some thunderstorm activity, with also a cold front through the state, but it's going to hang up somewhat. So that might generate a few isolated thunderstorms in central Nebraska. But Friday looks like to be the best chance in eastern Nebraska for precipitation as the ridge kind of backs off a little bit as another piece of energy moving in the upper air trough over the southern Canada tries to work its way into our region, and that'll drive a cold front through the state. So there's not a lot of moisture to work with, but at least there's a chance for some scattered, isolated shower activity. The most concentrated area will be well to our north and east across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. As we go farther out in time, unfortunately, we see that keep that cool weather into the southeastern United States. That high pressure ridge remains to our west, so we're going to be kind of caught between the two of them here in Nebraska. So temperatures will basically be fairly close to normal in the east, but we are going to be well above normal across the west. And in terms of precipitation, it looks like that ridge rebuilds back in. That's going to shut off the moisture outside of for some isolated ridge runners. Those don't look to be very promising in terms of moisture. However, I will add that as we look at the 26th, when this model goes to the 25th, we start to see some thunderstorm activity trying to build into the state. So fingers crossed, it looks like maybe a more active pattern starts to develop toward the end of the month. So that's it for right now, Troy. It looks like overall we're going to be looking at a fairly dry forecast with a warming trend as we get the second half of next week. So not much in the way of drought really in store.
Thanks, Al. Next up, while corn rootworm beetles began emerging during late June and early July in southeastern and south central parts of the state, scouting is still very much recommended since the pests might not have emerged yet in northeast and western Nebraska. Market Journal's Bill Dodd caught up with Extension entomologist Julie Peterson to find out more.
Western corn rootworms can pose the threat of an economic infestation to corn growers across the state. These beetles lay eggs in the field that will overwinter. Upon hatching, these pests can feed upon corn roots and later on the silks, which could negatively impact the corn's pollination cycle. While we know the rootworm beetle has been emerging throughout the state over the last couple of months, weekly scouting of adult rootworm beetles is still highly recommended.
So in Nebraska, we do have two different species of corn rootworm beetle. The western corn rootworm is really common throughout the state. It's a small yellow beetle with black stripes on it. We do also have the northern corn rootworm. It's sort of a yellow-green color, but both of those beetles are out in cornfields right now. The life cycle is that the larvae feed on the roots in spring and early summer, and then usually around the first part of July, we start to see adult beetles emerging. We will continue to see more beetles emerging from the ground all the way into August, sometimes even a little bit later than that. So this is the right time of year to be going out and scouting and looking for these insects out in your cornfields.
Orson Welles once said, "What's happening now is what happened before, and often what's going to happen again sometime or another." These words ring true in this case, as typically the southeastern and south central areas of the state see emergence of the beetles sometime before they're seen in the northeast and western areas of Nebraska, giving producers in those parts of the state a bit of an early warning of what's to come.
We usually accumulate more degree days in our more eastern and southeastern parts of the state of Nebraska. So usually west central Nebraska is going to be maybe 5 or 6 or 7 days behind. So for a lot of different things, including rootworm beetle emergence and for some of our other insect issues, we're kind of looking sometimes to see what's happening further east and further south in the state to help inform what's going to be happening then soon a little bit further to the west.
If these beetles are spotted in your fields while scouting, you may be inclined to take action immediately. However, Julie tells me at this point in the season, you should be thinking ahead to next spring.
What we're thinking about more with the beetles that are in the field is that they are laying eggs there. Those eggs are going to spend the winter in the cornfield, and then next spring, the larvae will hatch out, and they'll be doing feeding damage to the crop, if it's corn, that's planted in that field next year. So decisions now for those beetles are really about managing the pest population that you will have in next year's crop, not for this year.
It's recommended to examine at least 50 plants per field. Furthermore, you should make sure that sampled plants are several paces apart to ensure that examination of one plant doesn't motivate the beetles to move to the next plant to be sampled. You should also make sure to examine the entire plant, as rootworm beetles will hide behind leaf sheaths and in the silks. If detected within certain thresholds, there are a variety of ways to approach mitigating the problem next spring.
Now, if you do have high enough beetle populations to be at or above those thresholds on the table, there's a few things you should consider for next year. You could rotate out of corn, grow soybeans or another non-corn crop that will not be targeted by the rootworm. As long as you manage your volunteer corn in that field, that should dramatically decrease the rootworm populations there. You can also consider planting a pyramided transgenic corn. So this would be a BT corn that has the Cry 3435 effective BT protein in it. You also could consider planting a non-BT corn, but using an insecticide in the furrow at planting time. Of course, you could also consider spraying for those rootworm beetles in this current year to knock down their populations and reduce further eggs from being laid in the field.
When it comes to spraying for these pests, it's been noted that these beetles have shown some documented resistance to some pyrethroid insecticides. Furthermore, it is highly advisable to continue scouting fields weekly, as maturing fields may be prone to rootworm beetles migrating into fields with new silks available and may need another round of treatment.
Yes, so we have been doing some research here at the University of Nebraska in the last several years looking at some issues with resistance for Western corn rootworm in particular. And we have found, especially in the southwest part of the state and then the west central part of the state, that our pyrethroid insecticides are really having resistance from the Western corn rootworm beetles. This is actually from both the adult beetles as well as from the larvae as well. So it's important to pay attention to the active ingredient of the insecticide and also the class. So the pyrethroids are the class 3A insecticides. This would include products like Brigade, as well as some of our at-plant products like Capture and Force. So it's really important to think about rotating away from those pyrethroids, using other modes of action, other active ingredients of insecticides in order to get really effective control with your insecticides.
If fields have been scouted and treated properly, these pests should have a minimal impact on your overall yield come harvest. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. If you'd like more information on corn rootworm beetles, we've included links on the subject as well as the 2020 guide for weed, disease, and insect management in Nebraska on the Market Journal website. Finally today, not all grass is a good thing. Common reed has two subspecies in Nebraska, the native variety and the non-native one. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh spoke with Nebraska Extension educator Gary Stone about the invasive non-variety and the plan you need to make in order to manage it.
The native species of common reed is helpful to Nebraska's wetland areas. However, there's a non-native species which causes more harm than good.
A couple of things to identify the differences between the two. The leaf sheaths on the native species are generally loose, so they can come off of the stem, whereas on the non-native, they tend to be stay on the stem. The stem texture on the native species is smooth. When you run your fingernail across it, it's generally shiny, whereas with the non-native species, it's rough, it's dull. The other thing I like to look for are the little black spots, or what I call fly specks, on the native species that are present, but are not present on the non-native species. So that in general is kind of how you can tell the two apart.
While Americanus is helpful to habitats, Australis will take control wherever it takes root.
Well, the non-native phragmites, or common reed species, it invades our riparian habitat, our waterways. It will take over those areas. It will force the other vegetation or native species out, which in turn reduces the biodiversity of our wetlands, which we desperately need to keep.
This noxious weed takes more than one management method to get rid of. There are no biological ways to combat the reed, so producers may need to turn to chemical treatments in order to take back control.
Well, the specific management options of an integrated pest management program, you can mow the species down. If you can get in there and do that, you can also burn it. You can graze it to some extent with livestock, but it tends to grow fairly rapidly, so you need to incorporate maybe a chemical option, either a spring applied or a fall applied treatment of either imazapyr or a glyphosate product, both of which have to be labeled for use in water areas. Generally, they've found that either a spring treatment when the grass, this is the grass, gets up 2 to 3 feet tall, you can see where it's at, you can apply it. Generally, it's coming through the old growth, so it's easy to see. Or, again, in the fall, after everything's died down, then maybe you might want to come in, burn off that old top growth, and then maybe get some new regrowth to come up and then treat it then.
The non-native species of common reed is not new to Nebraska. As seen in the past, if not taken care of initially, it will come back again and again.
Well, I know that earlier on, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was quite a problem in the North Platte River Basin in the Central Platte area. They did some major treatments up and down the river, but I don't think that they treated all the waterways that fed into the river, and they didn't get the phragmites there. And so now it's coming back into our river system, and we need to really take a hard look at that and see what we can do to manage it better.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. Nebraska Extension has several publications on noxious weeds, including the common reed. These can be found at extensionpubs.unl.edu. We'll post that link on the Market Journal website as well. That's going to do it for this week's show. Remember, if you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app and follow us on social media so you can join in on the conversation. And you can also get the latest updates on the coronavirus outbreak at covid19.unl.edu. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.